What's up, everyone? Happy Sunday. Happy Mother's Day to the pregnant people and birthing people out there. Stupidest terms ever. And I hope you're having a great day. I'm coming at you live from Zurich, Switzerland. Been here for 4 days, 5 days, something like that. And in my hotel room, I was in this like crazy castle built centuries ago. Amazing place, about an hour outside of Zurich. And so I came into the city today to hang out, here for the night, and heading back home in the morning. It is almost 8 p.m. when I'm recording this, but for all of you back home, it's like noon or something like that. So, this topic has been on my mind for some time. As I've mentioned before, I've got a long list of ideas I'd like to go over. But this week, with the leaked draft Supreme Court ruling, I decided to do the topic of abortion today, but from an angle that I haven't seen anyone talk about. And that is why our church has been comparatively silent on the issue. Both comparatively silent and relatively silent. And I'll explain what I mean by both of those in just a moment. So, I'll probably pontificate a little bit here on, abortion just in general because it relates to the subject. But my main focus today, I want to be on why the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, though having a fairly strong position, does not have a strong public advocacy of that position, which I think dilutes, minimizes, weakens, even to some extent, it validates that opinion, that position. So let's get into it. Of course, all of you know what happened, I'm sure, in the ruling this week. There was a draft opinion released that the Supreme Court might be officially releasing in the weeks or months ahead, basically overturning Roe v. Wade. And all of the, birthing people and their allies are freaking out because it's the end of Roe v. Wade and the constitutional right to kill babies. And so they portray it as this, what's that TV show with like the white hoods and the red cloaks, that dystopian whatever that people share about like women who are turned into sex slaves and whatever. So I've seen memes like that going around from the left, and they're claiming that it's going to be this horrible thing, when really all this is doing is taking it back to a pre-Roe position, which is the constitutional position, which is states should govern on this issue, just as they do on murder. Murder is not a federal policy. There's nothing in the Constitution, U.S. Constitution, about it. The matters of life and death are under the jurisdiction of the states. They did not delegate that issue to the federal government in the Constitution. So under our system of law, the proper place to handle issues like this are at a state level. So that was the basis of the ruling. Basically, this would go back to the states. Of course, this would not overturn abortion, make it illegal. There's going to be plenty of states that are going to be very welcoming of abortion. There's probably going to be the Wendovers of the world that set up locations just on the border of non-abortion states to basically, come get your liquor, your lottery tickets, and your abortion, right? You're going to have different state policies like that. You're going to have employers who pay their employees in non-abortion states to go get abortions in other states. We're already seeing some companies coming out. Apparently Tesla is even doing that. I've seen other companies as well. So this doesn't end abortion. This ends the current status quo that claims that there is a supposed constitutional right for women to pursue an abortion. Okay, and so the freak out here is really interesting. I've been watching a lot of this, time permitting, because I've been extremely busy out here in Switzerland, but I've been scanning the news and Twitter and whatever just to see where the conversation is going. And of course, the left and all the MSNBC talking heads are going nuts. I laughed at one. I read this morning, this kind of abortion activist was on an MSNBC panel, and she said that the pro-life movement is, quote, based in racism and xenophobia, which I find to be hilariously ignorant, because it was Planned Parenthood's founder, Margaret Sanger, who openly said that the purpose of Planned Parenthood was to basically abort black babies. It was specifically a racist policy and program and effort and goal. That was the basis of abortion. When you look at the numbers of aborted babies today, it is still, predominantly black babies that are being aborted. So to claim that the pro-life movement is based in racism and xenophobia is hilariously stupid. This activist went on to say that, the pro-life movement is trying to shame pregnant people. Of course, it's not women. It's still pregnant people and birthing people and all this trans nonsense, designed to shame pregnant people who are choosing abortion healthcare. I'm going to get in a little bit later to the manipulation of words, and there's a fantastic quote from Neil A. Maxwell on this that you will not want to miss. This is a great quote, as are most of Neil A. Maxwell's. That guy was a boss. So I'm going to share his quote in a little bit about the manipulation of words, right? Pro-choice, abortion is healthcare, reproductive rights, right? All this nonsense. Granted, this is effective public relations, right? This is good propaganda. If you want to advance something that goes against people's consciences or that they otherwise might not support, you want to manipulate the English language. That is how you get them to, overcome some of these problems and biases. And I mean, on this idea of reproductive rights, I'll get in later to the other words and the Elder Maxwell quote, but on this issue of attacking reproductive rights, I've always found that to be odd, because no one, in the so-called pro-life movement is attacking anyone's reproductive rights. You're welcome to reproduce. There are no laws banning reproduction or limiting, reproduction. The termination of your reproduction is a different matter, but to couch this in terms of reproductive rights is stupid. That right is not under any threat. It's why I oppose the term black rights or gay rights, right? It's like, okay, sure, maybe with gay rights, with the sodomy laws of decades ago, and they were actually, but the court dealt with that, and we actually got Utah to repeal that law a few years ago. And so that notwithstanding, gay rights, there's no such thing. I mean, black rights, you have the right to be black. Now, discrimination and having the government, pass anti-miscegenation laws or treat people that's a totally different issue. But this idea of black rights or gay rights or reproductive rights, I think, are poorly named things, because everyone has the right to be, black or gay or reproduce. So reproductive rights, I think, is problematic. Let me just get into the abuse of language now. This idea of pro-choice. So I'll get to the church issue in just a moment. And there's a couple unique insights I think you guys might find interesting, including some research I did on just how many times the church leaders have been talking about abortion. This was shocking to me. And it's shocking to me for a reason I'll get into, and that is all these young Mormons and mommy bloggers and influencers and stuff have very strong pro-choice leanings. And I lay some of the blame at our leaders who have been, as I said earlier, comparatively and relatively silent. And I have some data to share about that to substantiate that, so stick around. But on this issue of abusing language, pro-choice is such a stupid term, right? It's you chose to have sex. You chose to engage in hookup culture and sleep around. You chose, you have all the choice in the world. And frankly, even I'm okay with the idea of pro-choice for referring to abortion. You have the right to choose. You can choose to kill someone. You can choose to abuse your spouse. You can choose to beat up the kid down the road. You can choose to, pee in someone's lemonade. All these things are choices. You have all the choice in the world. Those choices exist. No one has taken them away from you. What you don't have, I would argue, is agency. I think this was in one of my first Sunday musings I did, talking about what agency means. Perhaps some Latter-day Saints are confused because they feel God gave us agency and we have the right to choose. And so, individuals should be able to choose, whether to get an abortion. I'm anti-abortion, but I'm pro-choice. right? And they kind of confuse or conflate this idea of agency and choice, right? But like, yeah, I'm sure we're all pro-choice. Like you can have the right to choose if you want to, cheat on a test or, steal from your boss or murder someone or whatever. Like those choices are yours. I don't think anyone disputes that you shouldn't have the right to choose. But agency, as you may recall, the definition is based on the idea that we are God's agents, right? We are supposed to be doing what God would do in our stead. Like this whole idea of us being instruments in God's hands, right, is born of the idea that we are God's agents. Just as if I hire an attorney to go represent me in, a negotiation and signing a contract, that person is my agent. He should only be doing what I empowered him to do, what I would be doing if I were there physically present at the negotiating table, right? He's my agent. And so his agency is to do what Connor told him to do and to do what Connor would do. That is agency. That, this idea of moral agency, it's not, I can do what I want, eat, drink, and be merry because we got choice. No, like agency is doing what God would want us to do. Okay? And so the term pro-choice is problematic for that reason and confuses people, I think. Because fine, anyone can choose. You can choose to, terminate your pregnancy, quote unquote, kill the baby growing within you. That's your choice. Doesn't mean that's what God wants you to do. Doesn't mean that's morally right. Doesn't mean it'd be, it's your choice to shoot someone in the head if you want. Fine, that's your choice, right? But there are things that are right and wrong. Having choice is not an inherently moral thing, right? Just like having a gun is not a good thing or a bad thing. It's a tool, and it's what you do with it that matters. And so choice is a tool. It's a vehicle for human action. It's the action that matters. So saying pro-choice is ridiculous. It's morally neutral. And so choose all day long. Like we all make choice, big whoop, but it's what you're choosing that matters. So here's this quote from Elder Maxwell on this issue of kind of confusing language, pro-choice, reproductive rights, abortion is healthcare, right? These manipulations of language. Here's what Elder Maxwell says. Ironically, as some people become harder, they use softer words to describe dark deeds. This too is part of being sedated by secularism. Needless abortion, for instance, is a, quote, reproductive health procedure. Illegitimacy gives way to the wholly sanitized words non-marital birth or alternative parenting. And as I say this, as I just shared that, I realized that the quote that I pulled up actually left out one of the more important ones that I want to share. So I'm going to pull this up really quick. So Neil A. Maxwell, and I'm pulling this up in the data that I'm going to share with you in just a minute. Okay, here we go. So needless abortion, for instance, is a reproductive health care, which is an even more spongy expression than termination of pregnancy. Which I like that he said that, a spongy expression. As people become harder, they use softer words to describe dark deeds. I think that is what's going on here. And so, okay, the church. Let's get to the church, right? I thank you for indulging me in ranting on abortion real quick. I could say all kinds of other stuff. I mean, and ultimately this is not a legislative thing, right? Like this is a moral thing, and no law is going to fix this issue if people want to, kill their offspring. You cannot compel righteousness and morality through Caesar. You just can't. So we've got bigger issues here. But that is what irks me. Because what I'm going to share today is not to say anything about the law per se. It's about the church and its use of its bully pulpit, if you will. Its ability to influence and persuade. And why has it been so silent? And I'm going to share a little bit of data to back up that claim. Okay, so what does the church say about abortion? We all know the policy, right? Elective abortion for personal or social convenience is contrary to the will and the commandments of God. Church members who submit to, perform, encourage, keep that in mind, encourage, pay for, or arrange for such abortions may lose their membership in the church. I want to talk about that. And then it goes on to say, church leaders have said there might be some exceptional circumstances, such as when pregnancy is the result of incest or rape, or if the mother's life is in danger, or when the fetus is known to have severe defects that will not allow the baby to survive beyond birth. But even in these circumstances, it says that doesn't automatically justify abortion. It just means, prayerfully consider it after talking to your bishop, basically. Okay, so that's the church's position. We all know about that. And I would quibble with that. Briefly. I don't think that incest or rape is a valid basis for abortion, right? If I have a boat and I'm out in the middle of the ocean and some dude on a helicopter lands on my boat and throws his kid out onto the deck and flies away, right? I now have this child on my boat through no fault of my own, ended up there. I have limited food. I have, whatever, right? I have limited time, attention, whatever. And here's this kid. I didn't ask for this kid. I didn't ask for any of this. But that's a human. It's a child. It's defenseless. Do I have the moral authority to throw that kid overboard? I mean, you might argue like, well, the law of the sea, the captain is I don't think, again, I'm God's agent. I don't think God would say, chuck him overboard, right? I think it's like, look, totally get that you did not ask for this, but that's still a life. And that can become a child that could lead a fulfilling. Like, there are plenty of examples out there of, women who were raped, who went on to give birth, and like that child led an amazing life and posterity and all the rest. And so I don't know that the rape position is quite right. Incest is kind of a weird one, obviously. But again, like, these are so minor. And so people are like, oh, well, because of these exceptions, therefore we should be pro-choice and just have, abortion on demand for whoever. Like, I don't think it works that way. I don't think you can cite the exception to justify the rule. So that's the church's position. Okay, good. We're clear on that. Now, what has the church done about it? I'm letting there be a little bit of silence on purpose. Okay, what has the church done about it? I would say largely silence. The church newsroom, for example, has, if you go look it up there, they basically cite and rely on ultimately a statement from 1991. The church has issued a new statement on abortion dated January 11, 1991. It reads, and then it goes on to say this statement about abortion, some of which then became the current handbook policy. Okay, this is what's interesting. I'm going to focus on two little parts here, and this will be my segue to share this little bit of data that I have compiled. And it didn't take long because there isn't much, which is my point. All right, so here's part of this statement from 1991. In view of the widespread public interest in the issue of abortion, we reaffirm that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has consistently opposed elective abortion. True. For like over a century. Oh, okay, here it continues. More than a century ago, the first presidency of the church warned against this evil. They called it like infanticide at the time and feticide, the killing of the fetus. So it wasn't known as abortion until later. All right, continuing. We have repeatedly counseled people everywhere to turn from the devastating practice of abortion for personal or social convenience. Remember that. We have repeatedly counseled people everywhere. I'm going to get back to that with the data. Because have they? Repeatedly? Stay tuned. Okay. And then it goes on to say, okay, this was weird. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as an institution, has not favored or opposed specific legislative proposals or public demonstrations concerning abortion. Inasmuch as this issue is likely to arise in all states in the United States of America and in many other nations of the world in which the church is established, it is impractical for the church to take a position on specific legislative proposals on this important subject. I'm going to call BS. If you listened to, was that, I believe, 2 weeks ago, in my musing. I shared all kinds of examples of positions that the church has weighed in on in Utah. They've taken positions in other states and at the federal level and so forth. If they can take a position on alcohol, like all the time, and if they can draft legislation on so-called, religious freedom and gay rights and anti-discrimination policy, as they have, if they can be involved in marijuana legislation, I mean, there's plenty of other examples. The point is there's selective engagement on legislative matters. And again, I don't think that legislative solutions are like ultimately the solution to abortion. But I also think there's a clear moral and ethical basis to ban abortion after the first trimester, or at a point at which the baby can survive outside the womb. I think it is unconscionable from a legal standpoint to allow the killing of a baby that can survive on its own. I mean, that is effectively, in my mind, murder, especially so in cases of consensual sex, which is almost all of these situations. And yet, what do you have after the draft opinion of Roe came out? You had the congressional Democrats get out on the steps in front of the Capitol in supporting legislation that they're promoting to do what? To legalize abortion for the entire pregnancy, up to 9 months. What is so magical, riddle me this, about passing through your mother's birth canal that it confers legal rights on a child? In other words, 1 minute after you're born and you've come out through the birth canal, right? You take your first breath. Ta-da! You're now a legal, citizen and human being that deserves the full protection of the law, which, as a tangent, I might add, there are crazy people out there who are so pro-abortion that they actually advocate for being able to kill born babies up to a certain point. Like, those videos are out there from these crazy people advocating this stuff. They exist. I said this on Twitter a few days ago, and some of the, abortion wackos were like, "Oh, that's totally made up. You're like, no, it's not. Like, those people are out there." But it's a tangent. Those people are crazy. So 1 minute after you're born, you are magically deserving of legal protection. But 1 minute before you're born, you're not? Like, how does that make any rational sense? Right? Yes, I made it out of the vagina. Protect me. Like, that is not the right way to draw the line when it comes to understanding what a human being is. I've always found it so odd, right? Like, we're looking for life on Mars and everyone's like, ooh, the Mars rover, like, look, it found this little thing that looks like it might have been created by someone or part of civilization. Or, like, I tell you, the moment we find what do they call it? Like not a single cell organism, but like the moment we find basically 2 or more cells, life on Mars, people will just be exploding with glee, especially all the lefties, because they're so morally inconsistent, as we've clearly seen from COVID, right? It was my body, my choice. And then we have COVID, where that argument totally went away, right? Now it's, your body, my choice. And I should be able to force you and make you do things, even though it's your body, it's not your choice. And suddenly now the Roe v. Wade might get overturned. Now they're back to my body, my choice. Again, totally inconsistent. But I think that is the most consistent thing about people on the so-called left, is their inconsistency. And I'm not giving any passes to conservatives, because I think they're also widely inconsistent as well. Topic for another day. So we find life on Mars, and everyone's going to be like, oh my gosh, this is amazing, right? Life. And like, look inside that mother's womb. It's the same exact thing. Now, fine, you can say, okay, well, it's the mother's body, and let's have that kind of debate about, should a mother, is it her body, or is the fact that she had choice of consensual sex and that was her choice, and so now there's another body in there, and so it's not as so simplistic to say it's the mother's body, just as it's not so simplistic to say it's my boat on the ocean, so I'm going to toss the kid overboard, right? There are other factors in play, and that is a human being, and that is a life, just as we would call it a life on Mars, and all the abortion folks would call it a life on Mars, yet they're unwilling to do the same thing for a human child. And so, and so, where was I going with all this? Where I started, I certainly went off on a tangent, was that the church is being inconsistent in how it decides to engage in policy making, right? They say, again, this is 1991, in as much as that, like, they're basically saying this is going to be an issue in a bunch of states and countries. So it's not practical for the church to take a position on specific legislative proposals on this important subject. Again, BS, right? They do it on all kinds of other issues that matter far, far less. Oh, that's where I was going, right? It's the specific legislative proposals. There's some bills out there that I would, oppose and find problematic. But if there's a bill that says, let's say after, how many weeks are there in a pregnancy? It's like, is it 40 weeks? It's been a while, right? 9 times 3, 40 weeks. 9 times 3, 9 times 4. Sorry, bear with me. I've got jet lag and brain fog. So let's say there was a bill that said banning abortion after 20 weeks, when that child can live outside the mother's womb, in a NICU with an incubator and support and be adopted. I think that would be a valid legislative proposal, because that is a human life deserving of protection. And at what point, like, we can have the debate about when human life begins. Fine, let's debate it. And I don't even know what I believe. But it's very clear that once that baby can survive outside of the mother's womb, that is clearly a human life. I don't know when it started necessarily, right? Like heartbeat, or when the, zygote split into two. Like, I don't so much care about when human life started, but when it is very clearly self-sustaining, or has rather the potential to survive outside a mother's womb, I think it's very clear that should be protected under law, because there's nothing magical about passing out of your mother's birth canal. That should not be the basis of legal protection. Oh, okay, kid, like, if you can make it all the way out, like, then, but then you have this fully formed child that could easily be delivered, but then the mother decides, because the Democrats want to do a 9-month abortion bill, that you can go in with forceps and rip body parts and pull that, like, and dismember that body. Like, that does not make any sense. Okay, so getting to the point, let's say I don't know where. Let's pick on Nevada. Let's say Nevada has a legislative proposal to ban abortion after 20 weeks, or the point of viability outside of the womb, whatever that is. I don't know off the top of my head. Here the church is saying, at least 3 decades ago, and I know of no policy change on the matter, that they would not engage on that bill because it's impractical to do so. What? Like, this is where I think having a position is diluted or minimized, or in some cases potentially invalidated, if you are not willing to back it up with action. If you just kind of like let an opinion float out there, like, do you really believe it? Especially if you show a little bit of inconsistency by engaging on policy matters of far less importance. I think that's wrong. I think this is a supremely important issue. And whether you want to go rah, shish kumbah, let's go to the legislature and pass a law, or just preach against it and advocate against it and shift the culture and the sanctity of life, and have the debate about, let's encourage adoption, and so forth, rather than abortion. I'm not saying it has to be a political thing, but it is a social and ethical thing. And for the church to sit this one out, in my mind, is extremely problematic. I've shared before some stories about how, like, the Jehovah Witnesses are, one up in Mormons in all these areas, like when it came to the Nazis, calling out the Nazis and so forth. And so here you've got, like, the Catholics and the evangelicals. They're going to the pro-life rallies. They're supporting, pro-life legislation. They're engaging. They're donating. They're coordinating. They're doing stuff. Where's our church? Some of you may know that my mom is pretty involved in this issue. In Utah, she's part of or used to lead, or I don't know. She's been involved in a few organizations, but she's part of Pro-Life Utah. And so she's gone to the rallies, and she's gone to the legislature, and she's, done a lot of stuff on abortion. And so you talk to her about this, as I have, as you might imagine, and it's very frustrating for her to see the church silent. She knows the stories that I've shared with all of you, and then some, about the church's involvement in Utah political issues. And so imagine yourself in her shoes, where you're deeply passionate about this issue. You know the church's position, which is consistent with what she's trying to advocate for and whatever. And yet the church is not willing to back up their words with any level of engagement. And yet she sees the church engaging on other issues, when yet their position as of 30 years ago, which I'm not aware has changed, says, oh, well, it's not practical for us to get involved. And yet they're getting involved in other stuff. And, Mitt Romney's running for president, so let's talk to Utah legislators about not running certain bills because it'll make the church look bad. What's going on? And so, so she's frustrated, as you might imagine. And I'm not going to share other details that I'm privy to here, but the point is, she's frustrated, and I think has every right to be. And I see this inconsistency. And it makes me kind of question, who's making this decision and why? Okay, so now let's get to the data. This was shocking to me. I did not expect this. So I went to scriptures.byu.edu. If you've not used this resource, it's a fantastic tool. I use it often. Basically what you can do is it pulls up all the scriptures, and you can click around and you can pull up a particular verse, for example, and it will show you every time that scripture has been cited by a general authority, typically in general conference, but it also pulls in the Journal of Discourses and the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith and all these things. And so it's a fantastic tool, because many times in the past I've said, hey, I'm giving a talk, or in my book I'm writing on this topic, or I'm doing a Sunday musing on, this scripture about agency or whatever. And boom, pull up the verse or the set of verses, and it'll show you all the things that different general authorities have said. Highly, highly useful. So I really recommend it. Scriptures.byu.edu. The nice thing about this tool is not only can you search by scripture, you can also search by keyword. Down on the bottom right, there's a little search magnifying glass. Okay, so I said, all right, let's take the church at its word, where it says, said in 1991, and I quote again, if I can find it's in this same thing I was looking at. They said 3 decades ago, we have repeatedly counseled people everywhere to turn from the devastating practice of abortion for personal or social convenience. So I'm on a bus this afternoon, coming down from a tram. If you follow me on Instagram, maybe you saw my little video. And so I've been out touring Zurich all day, and between stops and the tour guide saying stuff, I was pulling things up and looking around. And so when I read this on the little tour bus, that word repeatedly popped out to me, stood out. And I said, well, what does that mean? We've repeatedly counseled people everywhere to turn from the devastating practice of abortion for personal and social convenience. So I said, all right, when I'm got some time, I'm going to go look this up. So I looked it up, scriptures.byu.edu. I typed in abortion. I created a little table here listing by decade, starting in the 1970s, which is during the Roe era and the lead up to it. Okay. 70s, 80s, 90s, what do they call them? The noughts, I think. Sounds so bizarre. The 2000s, the 2010s, and then 2020 to date. Now, I'm going to pause for a second. I want you to kind of mentally think through, our church has a pretty strong position. And so how many times have church leaders, general authorities of all stripes, 70s, apostles, first presidency, everyone else, how many times have they talked about abortion? And let me maybe qualify this. When I say talk about abortion, I mean in more than 5 words. Because occasionally what happened is they'll list things, right? We decry pornography and abortion and extramarital affairs and, drugs and blah, 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 right? So let's set those aside. Those passing references, I'll call them. Think, make a guess. Per decade, what would you say? 5, 15, 50, 100? How many times do you feel, or would you suppose, that our church leaders have spoken on abortion? Again, with that qualifier that it's more than just a little passing reference. Now, as you kind of give that some thought, let me add a qualifier. I'm using scriptures.byu.edu as my source for this data. From all of my past use, I believe it's completely comprehensive, but I don't know that for sure. However, I've used it a lot, and I think they catalog like every, general conference statement address. So I have all the reasons to believe that when I'm searching this thing, it's a comprehensive search. And the other thing too is I'm using my discretion on that qualifier I mentioned. That one's like a teeny passing reference. I'm not going to include it. In fact, in my data, I have bad data because I was being generous. I included some tallies in my data that don't meet my qualifier because I'm like, well, okay, I'll include that one, I suppose. So it's even worse than my data says here. Okay. So let's start in the 1970s, the era of Roe. Actually, I'm gonna kind of fast forward because my data, I actually skipped ahead. So I don't have comprehensive data for the 70s and 80s because I wanted to focus on the 90s and since. Okay, and so in the 70s, there were 5 to 15. Again, I didn't paginate all the way through, but they were talking about it more because Roe was going on. And so there were, if I had to kind of guess, I'm going to say there were probably close to 15 references, some of them minor and passing. But President Kimball was kind of decrying abortion and so forth. So, in the whole decade, you had, a dozen or so references, all right? 80s, similar kind of around 10. Again, I stopped because I was focused on more modern times. Why? In part because this statement was given in 1991 and they said repeatedly, and granted, repeatedly refers to past tense. So when they gave that statement in 1991, they were referring to the 70s and 80s. And then you might say, okay, fine. That's repeatedly. That averages out to what? Once a year, which means an abortion reference every other general conference. So, okay, I'll concede that. That's repeatedly, once a year, to be talking about abortion. But my question then was, for reasons I'm going to mention in a moment about an article that came out a couple days ago, my question was, what has happened since 1991, since that statement came out, since that claim came out of repeatedly counseling people to oppose abortion, to turn away from the devastating practice, as it says. Okay, so in the 90s, there was 5 to 10. So again, after this 1991. But then I said, the issue is all these young people today, I'm going to talk about this article that mentions this in a moment. All these young people, right? This is 2000s and since. What is Gen Z hearing? What are the more recent statements? So then I searched, because you can also search by year. I narrowed it down to the 2000s, the noughts. Care to guess how many statements on abortion there were from 2000 to 2009? Again, kind of a dozen. You feeling maybe that's a trend that would continue? Maybe more for some reason, maybe less? Well, if we're going by my qualifier, 0. 0 mentions. The only mention in the entire time was from then Elder Russell M. Nelson when he referred to the seditious evils of pornography, abortion, and addiction to harmful substances that serve as termites to erode the ungirding strength of a happy home and a faithful family. We cannot yield to any iniquity without putting our families at risk. That's not really about abortion. That's about a whole host of evils. That, based on my qualifier, that does not apply, okay? Because that's a passing reference. It doesn't really dwell on the issue and really drive the issue home. So 0. Wow, that was surprising to me. 0 references to abortion, basically, for a whole decade in the early 2000s. Okay, what about the next decade, 2010 to 2019? Surely it was an anomaly, right? Surely that was the exception. Well, again, I was being a little generous, so I counted. Again, this was a more accurate count based on the data from the system. 5 references. I think I would really only count 4, maybe even 3, but I think 4. So 4 references that were solid, references to abortion. But then you might say, all right, 4 talks. At least that's every other year or so, right? That's still getting the message out there. Not as much as, what's the term, the covenant path? That's like in every talk these days. You can play Mormon bingo now, or Mormon, what do they call it, the drinking game, right? Like, oh, they said covenant path, take a drink. It's interesting that how our church culture, the vernacular goes through these phases where there's the popular term of the day and it's used for a few years, and then we get the new one and everyone's saying it, and then we move on to the next one. Just kind of interesting observation. But so sorry, that was a tangent. So covenant path. But you might say abortion was being mentioned in the 2010s. If it's 4 times, it's at least every 2.5 years. So that's every 5 conferences. But then what I did is I copied and pasted from those. I even did the full 5 references. So I'll be generous here based on my qualifier. I took all 5 of those references for that entire decade, and I copied all of the text that related to abortion that was in each of those 5 references. Care to guess what the total word length was of all of these references to abortion for an entire decade in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? 101 words. So an average of 20 words spoken regarding abortion for an entire decade. I mean, that's not even an opening prayer. That's not even a fifth of an opening prayer. Especially some of those people giving opening prayers that take 3 minutes, right? 101 words and an entire decade. And when you remove the ofs and the thes and the ands and all of the irrelevant words, it's probably 15 words in a whole decade using any type of descriptive language or relevant, communication about the issue itself. 101. So again, that's generous using 5 of the references when it really probably should be 4. And it's also generous in counting words that have, no relevant, connection to abortion or the church's position on it. A whole decade. But at least we went from 0 to 4, so that's a good thing, right? And then how many, granted, we're in the early part of this decade, so we're in 2022. We've had 1 general conference this year. So including 2020, that's 5 conferences, okay, that we've had so far. There's been 1 reference. It was Elder Neil L. Anderson. I am appalled. I am shocked. This data was very surprising to me, very unexpected. When I read that 1991 quote and they said they've repeatedly counseled people, I was curious, but not that skeptical, because I know the church has a position and I know they've talked about it before, but I had no basis to understand how often they had done it. And so, a handful in the 70s, a handful in the 80s, a smaller handful in the 90s, and then nada. Comparatively. So what do I mean by comparatively and relatively silent? Compared to other churches that are, quote unquote pro-life, follow the Bible, etc. Compared to them, our church is silent. And relatively silent because relative to itself, relative to its own position, the strength of its position, the scriptures about being pro-life, the importance in Doctrine and Covenants 59:6, right? Thou shalt not commit adultery, nor kill, nor do anything like unto it. Like, so relative to our scriptures and the doctrine of the church and the sanctity of life, and that we are God's agents, he is entrusting us with the power to reproduce. We all have the right to reproduce, contrary to what the crazies say. We've been given this power from God, and relative to the church's position and our doctrine and the strength of all of that, relative to that, the church has been silent. So that's why I mean comparatively silent and relatively silent. Okay, so what is the concern here? The concern is that this silence in the past 22 years, I'll say, even though I would argue that in the 80s and the 90s, I mean, like one time every year in a 2-sentence statement, like, come on. Like, we need some pulpit pounding here. Tens of millions of babies are being snuffed out every year. We have a cult of death. This Babylonian sacrifice of child, on the child sacrifices on the altar of Molech, and this, all this garbage from societies in the past, we have today. We have a death cult. We have a glorification of the flesh. We have a secular, selfish, hedonistic approach to our culture. And the church is relatively and comparatively silent, and it shouldn't be. I think this is an issue that deserves some pulpit pounding. Even if you want to argue that rape and incest are a basis for allowing abortion, again, the pro-abortion crowd uses those minute of exceptions, those rarity of cases, to justify all the rest. The economic considerations, the social considerations, I'm too busy, I'm not ready, I was done having kids or whatever, right? But it's like you chose to engage in sex. Sex leads to babies. And so you had your choice. There's now another human. There is life. And again, I'm going to set aside the discussion of the plan B and the whatever, and we can debate about the beginning of life, and that would be a fun debate because I like debating. But my point here is if you have gotten to the point of viability, then that, I believe, should be outlawed. And I believe the church should be leading an effort to do that. Just as I think the church should be, decrying wars of aggression. It's one thing to have a position. It's another thing to advocate for. And I have gone on the record, if you will, in musings past about allowing the church a measure of grace for its silence, right? That there are institutional obligations and individual obligations. And I think this is especially the case for decrying war, because then you're being critical of governments, and governments can crush you or, hurt you a lot. And so that measure of grace has been the reason by which I've kind of let the church off the hook in not opposing the Nazis and not criticizing Mao and, Lenin and, Kim Jong-il in North Korea and Fidel Castro and, George Bush and weapons of mass destruction and all of these horrible people. And, Trump dropping, they called it, Moab, the mother of all bombs, the biggest bomb ever. I just met yesterday this amazing guy from Syria. His country is just a mess. And the United States has been, an important factor in that mess to make it worse. And Yemen and Libya and Afghanistan, all these things. And so I'm the church, man, we have an anti-war, modern revelation, God's law on war. I've mentioned it before. It is strong. It is completely contradictory to modern foreign policy. The church should, advocate for that. And okay, no, maybe not. Maybe that's for us as individuals to do, right? Maybe that's our role, because if the church does that, then the government is not going to take that lightly. They're going to oppose, shut down the church, the missionaries, whatever, right? So, okay, fine. I can see maybe why the church isn't involved, but we should be. And the church should make that clear, because if the church is asleep, our church culture is such that members go to sleep. If they don't see leaders doing it, they don't do it, right? If church leaders eat frosted flakes, the membership's going to eat frosted flakes. Like, we've got this sheep mentality, which I think is a problem, but it's there. And so if the church doesn't do anything, the membership doesn't take any other cues. So the church somehow has to communicate like, hey guys, we can't fight the government on this war stuff, but you should, because we're supposed to be pro-peace. So go get at it. Oh, okay. Let's go do it, right? But the membership's got to be told. But I think abortion's different. I don't think that if the church were to take a stronger position, legal or even just moral and religious, just being vocal and talking more and reminding the membership of its position, right? Because what happens if they don't? Here's what happens if they don't. This is an article from BuzzFeed, I think 2 days ago. And yeah, 2 days ago. Title is, some of the most viral, quote unquote, pro-choice Instagram content is coming from Mormon bloggers. Subtitle, or, little summary snippet. Mormon influencers are some of the most followed, analyzed, and discussed creators in the social media space. Some have been speaking out all week about the Supreme Court news, and many are standing up for a pregnant person's right to choose. They're not pregnant people, they're women, and it's not right to choose. Everyone has the right to choose about everything. You all have that right. So dumb. Language matters. And this gets to Elder Nelson's, Neil A. Maxwell's quote about hard people using soft language to cover evil deeds. I really liked that quote. But this BuzzFeed article goes on to talk about how all these like Mormon mommy blogger type people are saying, I'm anti-abortion, but I'm pro-choice. And, we need to talk about the economic health of women. Like, what does this lady say? I've seen this lady before. She says, there's been so much more open discussion about how women's bodies work, the economics of motherhood, and greater engagement in social justice issues generally. And that she also added that she believes that prominent Mormon influencers are having a quantifiable impact on the dialogue surrounding abortion in Latter-day Saint circles. And so they give these examples of these Mormon gals on Instagram and whatever who are going around saying like, I'm pro-choice. And maybe some of that is this confusion with agency and choice, which I've already described. But I think a lot of it is just they're part of this culture. They're part of the zeitgeist. The socially cool thing to do is to be pro-choice. Like, clearly we should all like support a woman's right to choose. And they're intellectually vapid, people, I think, largely, who have not really fully studied these issues, and they're going along with the culture's position. I talk about in Christ versus Caesar how culture is a derivation of cult. It is the manifestation of the cult. This is a death cult, and that is the culture. And so here's where the two connect. We have an entire generation of young people in the church who have not heard their leaders talk about abortion. Right? These are teenagers and young adults. These are, 22-year-olds on down, probably more than that, because the late 90s, if I constrain my search to the late 90s, it'd probably be minimal there as well. So it's like expecting anyone to know what's in the terms and conditions of software they download. Right? You download a piece of software and it's got this like 40-page thing, and buried down there is like, your expectations or your rights or whatever. No one knows, because you've not surfaced it to their view. You've not been clear to them. You've not communicated simply. Have you ever used like Google software, like say Google Docs or spreadsheets, or you sign into another service using Google, and then they get a little pop-up and it's like, hey, you're trying to sign in with Google. If you do that, this other app is going to have access to, and then they list it out, right? Your contacts, your email content, your browsing history, or whatever it is based on that app. But it is clear. It is very simple to understand. You've given informed consent. It is very a practical explanation for people to understand. But you've been upfront and clear with them about it. If you bury something in the terms and conditions, no one has any idea. And I think that is the issue with the church's approach to abortion, is that they've buried in the terms and conditions. Fine, it's in the handbook. Big whoop. Okay, you made a statement in 1991, 30 years ago. Big whoop. And even then, you were only talking about it once every 2 years, maybe 1 year. And even then, when you were talking about it, it was like this tiny little reference. Tens of millions of humans are being killed every year. We have a death cult that favors convenience over human life. We have a population saturated in propaganda to believe the manipulation of human language, the English language, to ameliorate their conscience and get them to go along with this madness. And we have poor arguments and bad data that people use to justify the whole thing. And the church is comparatively and relatively silent. And I don't think they need to be because of the government. I don't think it's like being anti-war or pro-peace. I don't think there's any threat to the church if they are more public. There may be a threat to the membership in the sense that, we'll lose members like these Mormon mommy bloggers on Instagram, that if the church, so again, going back to the church's policy, right? I said, take note of that word. Church members who, encourage abortions may lose their membership in the church. Just last week, I did a Sunday musing about, should I be excommunicated for having different views? And you may remember where I landed at the end. I said that despite all my kind of differing views from the mainstream, that my views are all, I believe, completely aligned with trying to build up testimony and point people to God. And that, I think, is the difference. That people who encourage other things, build up their own fiefdoms, look at me as a leader, let's do things contrary to this revelation, let's, distract you from God, blah, blah, blah. I think those are the things where the church has authority and justification, and perhaps even necessity in order to protect the flock, to remove those people from church membership. So here we have the church's position on abortion, saying that church members who encourage abortion, elective abortion for personal or social convenience, may lose their membership in the church. I don't know of a single person, I've never encountered any news story of any kind, in which the church has kicked someone out for being so-called pro-choice. I think that needs to stop. I think it's time for the church to draw a line in the sand, get a bit of a spine on the issue, you might say, and cleanse the church of these death culty Instagram influencer people and the like who encourage abortion. They're not encouraging a specific abortion, and that may be their defense. I'm anti-abortion. I said I'm anti-abortion. I just think every woman should have every pregnant person should have the right to choose. No, sorry, you're actually encouraging abortion. If you're not drawing that line and saying women should not have an abortion for elective reasons, right? Unless their life is threatened or the baby can't survive, after life, or incest or rape, right? Beyond that, you're encouraging elective abortion. Especially so if it's after that 20-week, whatever point of viability. I think the church needs to, at a minimum, talk about this more. And more than 101 words in a whole decade. Because you've raised an entire generation of kids who haven't heard you talk about this at all. You've buried it in your terms and conditions, and then you lament how society is going. I don't think we can be surprised by that. If I don't talk to my kids at all about, let's say, human anatomy or, sex, and then they go learn from TikTok and Reddit and their friends all this garbage and turn out to go crazy, right? I can't be surprised by that. I never talked to them. I never transmitted my values. I never told them, my views and my feelings. I never gave them those boundaries. I never guided them or whatever, right? And I think that's what is wrong with this comparative and relative silence on this issue. I think that needs to be corrected, because I think what we're seeing with these Instagram moms is that they're all kind of younger, right? They've grown up in this generation in which there has been silence from church leadership. And we expect them to know, let alone adhere to, the position that's in a handbook that no one ever reads, that, was shared in a random newsroom statement that no one read in 1991, that in passing these light little mentions, in general conference, like tens of millions of humans are being killed every year in a death cult, and our church is silent. 101 words in a decade is not enough. I believe this is an issue that merits some pulpit pounding, right? I think we got to get all like Bruce R. McConkie up in here or something, right? Like, let's lay down the law, right? Maybe a little Jay Golden Kimball to like use some, curse words in there too. Like, I don't often talk about this issue, in part because I'm kind of very political in a lot of what I do, and I don't think this is ultimately a political solution. I think this is teaching people. I mean, what did it say? Alma gave up his political position to go preach the word of God because that had more ability than anything else to persuade people to righteousness. Like, we've got to use our words. Words are how we communicate the ideas that God has taught us. We can't legislate our way out of this. Like, some laws here I think are valid, as I've mentioned, but ultimately we need people out there preaching the word. And so then you might say, well, this is also an individual issue. But I got to tell you, I know a lot of these people throughout the country who are kind of pro-life and everything, including, the woman who gave birth to me. Happy Mother's Day, Mom. And it is very disconcerting for them to see the church completely disengaged on the issue. And I don't think the church needs to be for any of those political considerations. I just don't think the governments are going to come attack them if they, take a strong stance, especially now that it's going to be turned back to the states. So I don't think that argument applies here. And I don't know what's going on. I don't know. But tens of millions of humans are being killed every year. I mean, countless millions are killed in war, and I kind of think the church ought to be outspoken a little bit more on some of this stuff and be pro-peace. But that, to me, it's amusing, I guess. I'm wondering, I'm curious. I don't know why. I'd love to sit down with someone at the church and understand this better, because comparative and relative silence when tens of millions of humans are being exterminated for matters of convenience in a death cult, of all the reasons to engage on the issue, I if not this, then what, right? I mean, are we just trying to get existing members to be a little bit nicer to others? Or are we trying to, rebuke sin, preach the word of God, be very clear about God's teachings, preach to the masses? I don't know. It just seems so milquetoast to be so soft, to soft pedal an issue like this. And there's some talks out there, from past decades that use strong language. Not a lot of language, but the language that's given is sometimes strong. So that's good. But something more has got to be done. I mean, 101 words in a decade. You could even say 101 words in 2 decades, because there was no mentions in the 2000s. So in 2 decades, let's say from 2000 until now, we got to then include Elder Neil L. Anderson's talk in 2021 last year, where he had a few paragraphs. So let's add in another 150 words. Again, kind of generous. So 250 words in 22 years. And when you take out the ofs and the thes and the ands, right? What gives? Again, I don't like this thing of I'm trying to study the ark, but freaking tens of millions of God's children are being snuffed out and exterminated by their own mothers. Of any reason to nudge the ark a little bit and be hey, you got this? It's kind of wobbling. Of all reasons or issues to do that, maybe this is the one. I'm so perplexed. And it's been on my mind a lot more this week because I haven't seen a statement from the church. I mean, maybe it's out there. I haven't seen it. I don't think it is. And, the Deseret News, again, the church should divest itself of KSL and the Deseret News and these things. Like the Deseret News, this article that they put out about the church, the Supreme Court leaked opinion, quoted all these like Planned Parenthood people and pro-abortion people and not one pro-life person. There was no balance in the article at all. The church's own newspaper was quoting the death cultists and not the church and not, the pro-life people. Like, I'm sorry, but this is wrong. It's messed up. It's got to change. And again, if not this issue, then what? You're going to quibble with alcohol and weed and, how many gay people a landlord can have in their house, in their apartment building, and water issues and whatnot. Like, okay, if you want to say we're just never going to engage on any political issues and just teach people correct principles and let them govern themselves, I'm 100% there. But that's not what's happening, as I mentioned 2 weeks ago. There's selective involvement in political issues. So they can't say, as they said 3 decades ago, like, oh, it's just too many states, too many countries, so we're just not going to engage. Like, we see you engaging. You do engage politically. So if you're engaging on these trifling issues, these silly little whatever type issues, but not on this like horrific, highly relevant issue to church doctrine, it looks wrong, I think. Thanks for letting me rant. I'm going to go stroll the streets of Zurich before I head out in the morning one last time, get a little bite to eat. Some good food here. It's Mother's Day. It's I guess we're going to rename that to be Birthing People's Day now. But I don't know. This one is a head scratcher to me. And I don't know. I just think something's got to change. And I don't know if it will. I hope it will. And maybe this returning to the States is going to create a lot more debate and give an opening for Neil L. Anderson to talk about it again, and some other, like Elder Nelson or President Nelson, who talked about it once, 4 decades ago. He had a pretty good talk about it 4 decades ago. So maybe we'll hear more, but I don't think the trend is going in a positive direction. And you might say, well, the members were warned. Like, this is another argument I've heard. Oh, well, we've been warned. We've been told. But I'm sorry, this is not an issue just for church members. I don't think many Mormons are getting an abortion. Like, sure, maybe some of these, Instagram mommies and their friends or whatever. Or, quietly hear stories of Mormon moms who get their daughter that slept with a guy, Plan B, and they take them quietly to Planned Parenthood so, they won't find, some of that stuff's happening in the church. And I think those people merit discipline, because I think this is a very clear and relevant policy to our doctrine. But I think this is an issue where the church should speak out for the world. I don't think this is like, hey, we need to make sure our members don't get abortions. I don't know that that's what we're worrying about. I think the world has embraced the death cult, and that the church or its leaders or its members should openly fight that death cult. I think, personally, that's what God wants us to do. I think my agency is that, right? Among many other things. And you look at the, biblical prophets of old, and it wasn't just like, hey, let's make sure these, few members of the church among us are doing the right thing. No, it's like standing up on the wall and decrying the wicked. It's preaching to the masses. It's pointing out evil. Because why? When you do that, you attract to yourself the people who are like, that is bold doctrine, or that is right. You've planted a flag, I am going to rally to that flag. But when you're silent, there's no flag planting. We talk about missionary work and, why are our numbers dwindling? And but if we're not flag planting, we're not attracting anyone. Right? What was that Joseph quote? Like, a religion that does not require all things of, I mentioned this before and I wasn't prepared before either. I can never remember this one, but it's, that does not require the sacrifice of all things can never produce salvation for people. But the point is religion should be hard and challenge us and motivate us and require the best of us. We should be bold in our beliefs, not milquetoast. We should openly talk about hard ideas, not shy away from them. And yes, we as individuals should do that. But I think also this is one where the institution ought to, as it openly has in the past, speak out about it. I just think 250 words in 22 years is, by any measure, and especially for a topic like this where tens of millions of humans are being killed every year, pathetic. I hope it changes. Signing off from Zurich. Have a good week, everyone. See you next week.